How are you today, Tim?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And you, Merv?
I'm doing great. So today we're talking about problem solving. I was going to come up with a problem for us to solve on this podcast, but I think people don't want to know about my problems.
I think we're going to run into enough problems. This is a fascinating section for me. I enjoy the human interaction of how we go around making decisions and how we solve problems. I've studied it from a physiobiological standpoint, the physics of the brain, a neurobiological standpoint, the neurotransmitters and the chemicals. I've learned from business decision making, but it's always fascinated me. Like when I was first starting at a transportation company back in my 20s, I'd see some people who are able to make snap decisions no matter what happens. Somebody gets hurt, they move in, boom, the problem's solved. There was a guy, always guys with silver hair would be right in the middle of a problem. And one of my supervisors was one of those guys. They just knew where to be, when to be. And it fascinated me that they were always ready to solve problems. Then there were others who just floundered and they were looking for direction. And I couldn't figure out what made one person one way and the other person the other. And actually, I found out as I studied this, when I got into graduate school, a lot of the experts are confused by some of this too. There's obviously some, right? You go to school, you learn, here's a method to solve problems. But there are other things that have to do with the human behavior. I am a human being, you're a human being. And there are some things about us that say, I look at the world a different way and you look at the world a different way too. How can we both solve problems differently, yet be very successful at it? And I struggle with that to this day.
So there's a couple of things. I mean, it's that you put a lot out there. So for me to unpack some of what you're saying, the people who floundered probably were fewer in gray hair. But that didn't mean that all gray-haired still didn't flounder. I suspect that's true. But I'll tell you what, my grandfather, actually both my grandfathers, I knew them both very well, grew up with them. I was one of the fortunate ones who had grandparents around that I could learn from. My grandfather with his 8th grade education and my other grandfather with his 3rd grade education could problem solve on a dime. They didn't need, stacks and stacks of books and all they could figure stuff out. And typically, I mean, they maybe didn't go, we're going to look at this later on in terms of our alternatives analysis and all the kinds of things that we use to solve problems. They could somehow within their minds figure out what needed to be done and just do it. Now, a lot of it dealt with obviously our farming situation. So a lot of it was physically, or was physicality. So some of those problems are less difficult to solve, but nonetheless, I saw them solve some very complex situation. So it's not always just the gray-haired guys, right?
Yeah, and that's what fascinates me. I grew up like you in a farming community. And when I was really young, I had about 350 people around me with the same surname, right? And these guys, one of my aunts would have a problem with their car, and it was a Model T. They still had Model Ts, and it was probably a junker. But they took it out to the back shed, and they broke it down, and they used a hand milling drill to re-drill and re-core the cylinders to clean it out and make it, and they put it back together and it was fine. Now, there was another guy. I spent a lot of my youth in northern Idaho, which is lumber country, as well as wheat and grains and other things. But they did a lot of lumbering, and they taught the guys how to use a certain type of stick, hold it like this, and then figure out how tall a tree is. They used it using advanced geometry, trigonometry,
And
they were
probably
doing, and they
and probably
only
didn't
had,
get
yeah, they were incredibly accurate, and they only had eighth grade educations, and
yeah,
they were using advanced math.
yeah, exactly. And probably didn't know it. It's just something that they learned over time from their parents and their grandparents. So yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
fascinating.
so if we see what the problems encompass many aspects of our life, I think we want to keep this particular, although I love these stories from outside of project management, but if we're looking at project management specifically, how would we define a problem in terms of our careers or our areas of responsibility as project managers?
Okay, so let me start, and then I'll hand the ball over to you. The PMBOK, Project Management Body of Knowledge, has a specific word for problem. They call it an issue. Now, the definition of issue surprises everybody when they learn it. It's something that has occurred or is occurring. It's real. It has a physicality, or it has an existential impact, right? Second of all, it may impact. It's not necessary that it has impacted, but it has occurred and it might impact. And they call it an issue, and it needs to be addressed, right? And you address that in many ways. It goes into great detail, but that's basically what a problem is. It's something that you got to deal with.
So in formality in project management, we typically track risks and take care of risks before they can become an issue. So that's probably part of our problem solving arsenal, right? Is the whole idea of risk management, risk mitigation, risk tracking, risk logging.
Right. And it even gets wilder than that, because we have issues and then we have risks. And then along with risks, we can even have triggers so that even the risks don't occur. So we have a multi-layered approach to strategically addressing problems.
But just getting it down to its basics, and for those people who are tuning in, who are looking at their first project management assignment, perhaps, it can be anything. I mean, it can be the loss of a key staff member. Suddenly your database architect disappears. He takes or she takes another job somewhere else. Or a user who is incalcitrant wants to add additional scope regardless of what the contract says, and you cannot change their mind and they don't want to do a change request. Or there's a late delivery of equipment that your development team needs. Or there's a staff conflict where two people just can't stand each other. I mean, I could go on and on and on with some of the problems that I've had to deal with as a project manager, or even as a team member, in terms of being able to deliver for my client.
Yeah, and the PMBOK has made it easier. The newest training material from PMI says issues can be broken into 3 categories: blockers, impediments, and obstacles. And a blocker creates work stoppage. Impediment creates the slowing down of work. And an obstacle, if you approach it in a certain way, you can go around it, over it, or under it. So it has a similar impact schema like risks do. But fundamentally, you're right. It's something that gets in the way of progress.
So the examples that I used, for example, the database architect, she decides to leave the project. That's a blocker if it's right in the middle of having to finalize our solution architecture.
Yeah, yeah.
But if she's considering it and she's looking for more money and she's causing kind of slowdowns that way, it's an impediment that you need to solve. It hasn't become a blocker yet. So there's varying degrees even within the same situation that we can come across.
Right. And all of a sudden we have a new tool in our arsenal called prioritization.
Yeah. Which is a tool that we use in life every single day, right?
Yes. What do I want for dinner? My favorite prioritization tool.
So do you think, so as project managers, do we need to solve every problem? Do you think we need to be there?
Oh, Okay, let's peel this apart. I thought about this hard, and I think there are two things I need to talk about. Number one, when you look at an issue, you say yes, no, or not today. Okay.
Oh, good.
Basically,
I like that.
yes, we need to address this. No, this has such low impact that we need to track it, but we don't need to solve it. And not today, which means it's not going away, but it's not high priority. And this is where your issue log comes in, where you can actually, every time you open up your issued log, just like your risk register, you reprioritize, right? We need to change it, need to change it. There's another thing that I just read this week that actually really changed my whole perspective on this conversation today, not just what we're talking about this second, but the whole conversation. General Colin Powell, he wasn't talking about issues or problems, but he was talking about decisions. And he said, if you have at least 40% of your information you need, and you have up to about 70% of the information you need, that's all you need. You need to act. You need to act and act right now. That 40 to 70%, he said, was the sweet spot within which you should be acting. And that's within one standard deviation on the bell curve too, which makes a lot of sense.
That's interesting. So when I thought about this too, I asked that question of you because you brought up prioritization. And I think I come alongside with you on this whole topic. And that is, yeah, I think problems need to be solved again by prioritizing. And I know if anybody has taken some time management principles or have looked at Stephen Covey's work with the Franklin Covey process, where you define things as A priority, B priority, C priority, and then within the A's, you've got 1s and 2s and 3s, etc. So I think if you're always sort of on top of your many problem or issues that you have to deal with, categorized, prioritized as A's, B's, and C's, then you can stay on top of them. But I'll tell you a little secret that I found. And I accidentally discovered this, but it has worked many times. Now, new project managers, hear me out. This is something that has worked for me. Don't go ahead and try this just because I said so. But I found often that sometimes I could delay a problem, looking at a problem, much like you were saying, the not today issue. And sometimes I would just say, I'm just going to ignore that. And lo and behold, how often those problems disappear. And suddenly I don't have to deal with them. But maybe that's just me. Maybe that's been part of your experience. But I often found that you don't have to jump on every problem every time it comes up. And sometimes they just take care of themselves without you having to spend effort.
Yeah, risks and issues are similar in this manner too, where they have a time component. They're basically locked in across some chronological schedule. And we don't know that. And if it is low priority and you do have data that says what I'm working on right now is higher priority, sometimes you do have that experience that says, oh, that's no longer an issue. Well, I was a wizard, wasn't I? Yeah. No, you were working on data that you didn't have, and you made it. But yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right, Merv.
So I like the Colin Powell. I hadn't heard that before, 40 to 70%. So that's interesting. But is there sort of a connection or the relationship between problem solving and decision making?
Yeah, addressing a decision and addressing a problem is a similar manner. Okay, a problem and its resolution are a decision. Okay, it's a subset. We have to agree on that. Okay, I have a problem. What is it? Well, here's the situation. Here's the impact. Here's the context. what do we do? How can we most improve our favorable position we are in today? And that's what the decision you're trying to make every single time. It's not necessarily a yes, no decision. It can be a grade decision. Yeah, we have a problem here and it's going to add 2 days. And through analysis of that problem, I found a way we can actually compress the schedule where it doesn't just, meet that issue, but it also removes another risk or maybe improves the quality. And so by solving problems, we are making decisions that have impacts way beyond the problems we're solving.
Yeah, that's good. I think there's another way to look at it too. You sort of took it from the problem solving became decision making. What if we also looked at decision making in terms of problem solving? And what I mean by that is people who can consistently make good decisions. And I don't mean perfect decisions, because nobody makes perfect, but let's say someone can make a good decision often, most of the time. A lot of times I found a good decision prevents a problem from even coming up, from happening.
Yes. And so that leads us to one of the big quality statements. Philip Crosby, how do I do work correctly? Well, it's not fixing it. It's not removing defects. That has nothing to do with quality. It has to do with adding things that will keep you from making defects.
Yeah.
So, in fact, solving problems, you can have greatest impact on a project in the planning part of the project.
Right. And that's where a lot of decisions get made, as part of the planning.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
a corollary to what I just said too, then that would imply, and I think it's true, that bad decisions can create problems. I think that's almost a given, that if you're consistent, or even if you're not consistent, but if you just make a bad decision, it can create problems. But let me throw one more thing out here. A lot of people get stuck in analysis paralysis. Project managers can do this very well. And what happens is then they make no decision, or they procrastinate on making a decision. And often that leads to a problem or exacerbating an existing problem. So a bad decision and no decision often end up in creating a problem or making existing problems worse.
So how do we stay away from that? And you make it simple. You make it easy. And this is how I trained my team. My team got in the habit of, my teams after about 6 months get in the habit of saying, okay, Tim, here's a problem. And I become a problem solving machine, and I don't want to be that. So what I started teaching my teams, and this rubbed out on my class too, is the law of necessary. The law of necessary says, if it improves the project success or minimizes project failure, it's necessary. If it maximizes if it minimizes project success and it maximizes failure, then it's unnecessary. Instead of feeling like a failure or success, using this metric of necessary allows people to make decisions and solve problems in a very, very mechanical, very programmatic manner that allows them to move efficiently and quickly. This mechanism, this simplification of how I solve problems, has actually improved not just the way I look at problems, but the way I can create a culture where problems are addressed.
So that again makes a lot of sense. So can I go back to how you started this podcast in terms of you being amazed at some, and I think you used the term gray hairs, which I'm thankful that I probably have a few of those right now, but that you were amazed at how well they could define that. And I think it becomes intuitive because it's practiced. And I think where I'm going with this is part of what I've learned also with this whole process is to allow my intuition to take place based on past experience. My example of the database architect who quit in the middle of solution architecture was a true story, actually, that happened on a project. But here's how I was able to mitigate it. I began to observe certain aspects of her behavior that made me start to wonder if something was going on. And I alerted my vice president and said, I think we have an issue here, or a potential, we have a risk here that is a potential issue. Could we line up somebody that's coming off another project who could step in a moment's notice? And wouldn't you know it, but a couple months later, she in fact did leave the project. We had this other person coming off a project who was a solid database architect and came onto our project and was able to pick up within a couple of days where she had left off. And we hardly lost any time at all. But I think, again, the problem solving with the intuitive approach to understanding people helped me to understand what might happen. Not necessarily that it would happen, but what might happen. We were able to resolve that quickly.
We're going to need to talk about intuition in the next few months, okay? Because this is becoming very important in the study of how we think, how we decide, and how we solve problems. And this isn't just in project management. This is basically personal development and self-actualization, the whole industry of this. And it seems that we're going back to ancient models of understanding the role of values in our life, such that we attract ourselves to the things that we like to do, which we value, and we do it a lot. And if we do it a lot, it becomes a habit. And if we refine these habits, they become a part of our behavior. And this isn't just physical, but this is thinking behavior too.
Well, and I'm wondering, I just read an article this morning, and it's shocked me actually, where as a result of the pandemic and people's uncertainty over the last 2 years, where approximately 65% of employees are looking to change their careers, change their vocation, change everything about their lives. And I'm wondering if what you just said feeds into that.
Oh,
prior to this, they were trying to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. Now they've understood more about their values and their needs to satisfy. You called it self-actualization, but I think I'm wondering if that all has a play in this.
Yeah, and we can talk about this too. If we just do a simple model of fulfillment of needs, right? Just simple Maslow. How many of those needs? Now, this is a major problem, okay? How many of those needs do we fulfill through our work?
Yeah, it probably doesn't reach the top of the scale, the hierarchy.
The self-actualization,
Yes, right.
but for some lucky few it does. But it's your respect, it's your socialization, it's your safety, and it's your physiological needs, right? Definitely. All of those are wrapped up in one thing, your job. And so we're seeing a lot of this interest in gig work, a lot of this interest in personal development, and a lot of this interest in maybe there's something better for me.
Well, and think about it this way too. We as project managers and project staff tend to think of problems as being, my equipment didn't arrive, I've got 20 bugs in this program, right? And we've just been talking about the people aspects. What do you think, or how, in your experience, do you think we spend more time as project managers dealing with solving people problems, or more technical or work problems, process problems, and those sorts of things?
I think early in our careers, we learn how to get a handle on our technical problems. schedule, scope, quality, risk, right?
Yeah.
And we get that nailed down, and then we put in mechanisms that solve those. And just like a society grows and gets more complex, we we push out those more complex problems to later on in our careers, when we have a little time to breathe and we have a little time to think about how to solve them, and think about what is going on in a human problem like communications, right? You think communication problems are easy. Well, no.
No.
Noise happens in two places. Noise happens right here between you and me, right? It's basically, I'm not receiving the message. No, that's not the only place it happens. It happens back here too. It happens in the interpretation. Noise is both in the reception of the message and interpretation. If I have a headache, if I'm hungry, if I'm distracted, and these are all human related. And if we go inside the human experience, we have the immediate response. We have the things that have been leading up to that problem. We have the human character, which creates the perception and the opinions. And then we have the expression of the genes. And then we have the enculturation. No wonder we don't have people coming right out with their PMPs saying, I know how to deal with people. You can't. You can't. It's not dealing with people. It's learning how to play within this whole complex, wicked, interacting environment that we call culture.
Well, and I think it's even a part of the trait of being a project manager. Typically, I'm not saying everybody, but typically we tend to be more analytical. And so therefore we tend to gravitate to solving those problems that are more technical or process oriented, because that's part of our nature. Human beings are they're explosive, they're bombs, you don't know how they're going to react. And so you kind of want to shy away from dealing with those kinds of problems. But then you realize as you mature as a project manager, you have to deal with those kinds of problems. These ones over here, the analytical ones, those tend to be very easy. But when you get good at the people side, you end up with a well-functioning, incredibly productive project team.
Yes, yes. Now, here's what I've been thinking about. Does the worldview that people have, their opinions and perceptions and habits, does that impact the way they solve problems? For instance, like you said, you gave me one part of the answer, but I'd like to look deeper into this. If I'm an analytical person, does that mean I approach all problems analytically? If I'm a social person, does that mean I approach all problems as a socialization issue? Is that clear enough for the question?
It is, and I don't necessarily think so. Although I would tend to go that way for the analytical person, because I've known some very strong extroverts who are also analytical. They would tend to also go to their analytical side to do the problem solving, as opposed to their extroverted, everybody's happy socialization type problem solving. But I think as you mature, you develop those techniques that are best used in the problem to be solved in that particular situation.
You're right. I believe like you. We bring the tools that we're most comfortable with, the tools we learned from the age 2 through 25, and we bring those to our work environments and use those first. And then by understanding the grander spectrum and the context of the problems that we're solving in business and culture and all those, we get to learn that there are better ways to do this. For instance, you talked about, extrovert, introvert, and I look at Myers-Briggs, and Myers-Briggs says, here's an introvert and here's an extrovert. An introvert tends to solve problems by, don't talk to me, I'm thinking this through and I'll get back to you in 10 minutes. And an extrovert says, come here, I need to work this out. Can you go in the conference room with me? And I just need to whiteboard this out. And the problems, this is what fascinates me. The problems don't dictate this. It's the way people look at the world that dictates how they solve problems to a greater extent.
Well, and the beautiful part of your illustration is that both will come out with equally satisfying solutions.
Yes, that's the wonderful thing. We can digress into greater detail here, but yeah, they're both viable. You know, you can be an introvert and be incredibly successful. You can be an extrovert and be incredibly successful if you understand those tools. Now, if you want to go the extra mile, like you said, as you grow and progress, you can learn these other skills that you can bring to bear, and they work in areas you might not be as strong in.
Exactly. And I just want to pick back up on a word you used a little while ago called world. You said worldview, depending on your worldview. I think there's also another aspect to this that I learned the hard way. You know, when I broke into the industry as an analyst, as a developer, and then eventually became a project manager, I worked with people who thought like me, who acted like me, who performed like me. But as I got older, and as I hired more and more people from college who were from the next generation, who were, by the way, smarter than I was, more intelligent than I was, probably more worldly wise than I was in certain aspects, I suddenly found that these people, a younger generation, didn't think like me. And so I had to learn that their worldview aspect of problem solving, their worldview way of solving problems was different than the worldview that I used. It wasn't wrong. In many ways, it was much more creative than I had been used to. But I think we also have to be aware that different generations bring different worldview aspects to the whole process as well.
Let me give you a great example of this. Those pesky millennials, right? They always have their noses in the smartphones and they're never paying attention. I realized something. When I was growing up, in order to win an argument, you needed facts and figures. Okay. These guys don't need facts and figures. They have too many. This is what they were built on. And so what these guys are working on is how I can use these facts and figures. So they're going another layer called logic and influence and debate. And they're refining these skills without having to go to university to study them, which fascinates me. Now, you put an old guy like me in the room who's a facts and figures guy, and you put 2 or 3 guys with smartphones and their noses right up to the smartphones, and you have something really cooking.
I'll give you a different example. Again, you and I come from largely the same generation, no nonsense, get the job done. Well, somebody on one of my projects from, I don't know if it was the pesky millennials or the generation behind them, but they decided that Friday was going to be bring your pet to work day. Now, in my way of thinking, now this probably has little to do with problem solving, but it does have something to do with worldview. In my way of thinking, pets were for at home. I grew up with the most wonderful dog you ever saw. He and I went hunting all the time. I love dogs. But in my way of thinking, in an office building, the dogs don't belong. That's how I thought. Now, these younger people, didn't think that way at all and brought their pets to work. Now, was I annoyed? Yeah, a little bit. I kept it to myself. I actually petted some of the dogs. I stepped in a puddle or two, which was not pleasant. But I learned very quickly that it's not always my way that's the best way. It made them happy, it made them productive, and it was a good day.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
This experience that you just talked about And experiences like this is what keeps us very young
Yeah.
and humble.
And humble. Definitely. And when I said these, some of the people that I hired, well, probably all of the people I hired, because I looked for the brightest and the best. They were all smarter than I was. They just didn't have quite as much world experience under their belts as I did. So I could still kind of show that I was, viable in their world. But I tell you, to keep up with some of these young people was a real trip,
Yes, it is.
So
So what, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
What's your favorite type of problem to solve? What do you like to sink your teeth into?
Oh boy, can I go back to my analytical days?
Please do.
And part of it's because I am somewhat of an extrovert. I'm just kind of over the line in Myers-Briggs as an extrovert. My favorite problems to solve are business requirement issues, where I can take an as-is process, look at the technology we're using to solve their problem, look at what it could be, the to-be process, and work with the user community in such a way that the light bulbs go on in their mind so that they can see what's possible, so that what used to be their experience could now become this new experience and give them a much better work environment and much better satisfaction on the job. So my favorite problems to solve are dealing with business requirements and making business go better through technology.
I agree with you. I have a foot in both worlds, the humanistic world and the mechanical, quantifiable world. And what you're talking about satisfies both those needs inside me. Number one, I have a more clear, efficient, and successful process. Number two, I have more satisfied, relaxed, comfortable, more productive group. Put those two things together, and that really excites me. And that's why I like working at the business level, at the systematic level.
And I got to tell you, there's a little bit of selfishness in what I just described, because when you can show them what's possible and when you give it to them through user acceptance testing and implementation, and they see the results of their analysis with me, I'm their hero. So there is a little bit of a selfishness there.
Oh yeah. The ego must be recognized. It must be. So that's a good problem. Let's dig into problems themselves. When you're looking at a problem, what are the things that you tend to forget about?
Oh, what to forget about or don't like? No, forget about. Yeah. Yeah.
What are the things you miss? Yeah, go ahead.
I think part of it comes from having been involved in project management for so many years and having kind of seen it all and done it all. And at some point, it becomes almost a rote process. I'm not saying that every problem can just be kind of dismissed through some sort of steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But at some point, you become accustomed to solving problems such that when something new or totally out of your realm comes along, you forget some of those early ways of dealing with the problem because they have become so rote or so traditional in your mind. So you forget 1 or 2 of those steps and suddenly you can't solve this problem.
So
how about yourself?
That you're talking about fundamentals and adherence to fundamentals. I agree with you. It's funny. We're a unique type of worker. When we go for a hike, a project manager doesn't put everything they're going to need on that hike. They put everything they're going to need to build what they need on that hike. They take all the tools and all the knowledge that they need to address any risk or issue that they are going to be addressing. And that's something that I tend to forget too also. I have some very reliable ways to look at things. There are some basic issues or parts of problem solving that I miss. Number one, alternative analysis. I
Oh, yeah.
tend to not look at alternatives. I say, this is the answer. And if I say this is the answer too quickly, I look at I look at getting that thing implemented as quickly as possible. And maybe quickly as possible is not the best solution. Maybe that, as a project manager, I need to see all the integration components. And that's where I fail. I'm really good in the details, but when I pull out, I have to still, after all these years, consciously go up to a higher level. And I say, yeah, that helped me with my schedule problem. But what about quality? What about risk? What about budget? What about my resources? And just doing a mental checklist that I have to go through every time that I'm dealing with any problem.
I can see that. I've had that and particularly when I was younger in my career, the first thing that would come in sounds like a good idea. You just charge down that path. And I would often do that. But I learned after a while, I think you called it earlier, a law of necessity.
Mhm.
I'm going to give another law, a law of unintended consequences. Sometimes
Yes.
when I'm thinking through a problem solve, I go, oh, but if I do that, what about this? I have to, and it's kind of what you were thinking, what you were saying is you talked about the alternatives analysis, but also you have to kind of think that if I go down this path and solve the problem in this way, I could really blow up something somewhere else. And I don't want to do that. So yeah, there's the unintended consequences side of how we do our analysis as well.
Yeah, one of my mentors in the early 2000s looked like a guy who retired from the Merchant Marines. He was probably 5'2" and almost as wide as he was tall, and really gruff. And he'd look, he'd look out of one eye at you and look like he was always squinting. But then he was always looking over my shoulder. And he said, "Tim, what's the alternative?" "What's the alternative, Tim?" And it was wonderful because it gave me an idea that doing something is saying yes or no. But in situations, we need to have a variation that says, yes, this is my yes path. No, this is my no path. And which one is better? Just slowing down to that point, creating an alternative. You could call it alternative zero, right? Creating that alternative will slow down and allow you the proper analysis your cerebral cortex needs to actually put its full weight behind, determining what the true impact of these issues are.
So we've talked about the kinds of problems we like to solve and the kinds of things we tend to forget in solving problems. What are some of the problems you don't like to tackle? Are there any?
Well, obviously, there are personnel problems on projects. I have started off with good formal project management training that said I am not the one designated by HR to handle personnel issues. That's an escalation path. And luckily, I had enough trainers and enough good supervisors to help me build that into my arsenal. But still, when I have a personnel issue, I know the effort involved in, making sure that the behaviors don't impact the project, and then ensuring that the person is not in a position to be dissatisfied, and then communicating and escalating with their personnel manager, and then being sure that I'm following the corporate guidelines and working inside other corporations. This has to be incredibly formal, and it's always a headache. It's a headache when you're working in a totally internal project, but when you're a consultant, it can be time consuming and complex, and you're always left after this with with some type of heartbreak.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Personnel problems are an issue, and that's more than just a personality conflict between two individuals on your team that you try to work out. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a serious personnel issue that basically is not, you are not, as a project manager, typically trained to handle. And certainly from a corporate standpoint, from a lawsuit standpoint, from all of the kinds of things that can emanate from a personnel issue, that's something that I don't like to get involved in. I'll alert the people that need to be alerted about the situation, and then back away.
The best way I even learned how to talk about this when in my training is that these are behavioral issues, and you as an individual cannot change other people's behavior. They have to have a need to change it. And so the best thing you can do is identify, escalate, and work in such a way that replacing that resource is satisfying for all parties involved.
I think another kind that I don't like to deal with are things that in the vernacular are above my pay grade.
Yes.
And I get so annoyed when I see even team leads grab onto something that really is not in their purview, and they'll decide that they're going to solve this problem, and quite often they make it worse. And so that's something that also maybe comes with maturity or experience, but there are certain things that you as a project manager, it's best to put the blinders on, not in terms of the fact that it could create an issue for your project. You still want to deal with that, but in terms of you solving or getting involved in the solution, there's some certain things that I don't get involved in.
Yeah, and let's maintain scope here too. What's the role of project manager, right?
Yeah.
Deliver something that meets and fulfills an objective. It's not to say that you are comfortable going against your values, but it does say there are certain things that, like you said, it's not within your scope, your purview. It's not within your level of decision making to make these decisions. And sometimes it has to be consciously articulated, at least within your own self-discussion.
And there's even times that I've been asked for my opinion on the situation, and I just say, no, I'm sorry, I am not authorizing myself to give an opinion in this situation. It is something that is beyond what I can control or influence.
Yeah, and that's where we get into trouble with certain biases like halo effect and hubris and all those type of things, where we're experts and we think because we're experts, we tend to be experts in everything. And it's dangerous for you to think of other people with halos. But when you start thinking of yourself with halos, this is where you go down a path of saying, no, don't you worry about it. I'll think this through. No. None of us, nobody on the planet is that smart.
Well, and there is an ancient proverb that says pride goes before the fall. So you want to have that level of humility and understanding. It's not just knowing your place, it's knowing where I think you used the word scope, the scope of your responsibility, and stay within that. Stay within that. It's best for the project. It's best for the corporation. It's best for your client.
And if you look in martial arts, it's the same way. Martial arts is basically moment to moment solving a problem against an opponent, right? And the greatest masters were not the masters who knew that fancy move. It was the masters who had their fundamentals in place, and they didn't go on beyond those fundamentals, and they practiced those fundamentals every single day.
That's a very solid analysis. Not being a martial arts person myself, but I did watch The Karate Kid. But in the few minutes that we have left, can we perhaps for the neophyte, for the wannabe project manager, for the project manager who has 1 or 2 projects under the belt and want to keep on growing, can we help them in 2 ways? Number one, help them develop a problem-solving method, something that works for you, something that works for me. And then secondly, how would we go ahead and teach them how to work problems using these methods? Is that fair to say in the last few minutes?
Oh, yes. This is right within my scope. This is in my area of expertise. Number one, there's 1,001 problem-solving methods. You know, the scientific method, the heuristic, multiple heuristics. There's mechanisms. There's all sorts of things you can find, right? Great. Find one that fits with the way you think and you're comfortable with, like Polya, right? Over in Berkeley, I think. He had a book called Solve It. If you want to look it up, it's cheap. You can even find it's on free. And it teaches his students in math a very simple 6-step way of solving any problem. I teach this to my students. And I don't teach it about solving problems on projects per se. I'm teaching them how to solve exam question problems on the PMP exam. And by the way, 90% of the problems are situational. So by using this method to solve problems on the exam, they're also learning a mechanism to solve the problem. And I found 3 components that are critical to solve. Number one, context. What's the background information, right? What's the surrounding information? Number 2, what's the real question? Are we solving a communication problem? Are we solving a schedule problem? Is it a bit of both, or is one causing the other, right? Number 3, what are the options and what are the variances to the options? That's all. Now, on the exam, if you practice this for 6 weeks, you can basically solve any problem on the exam. If you understand the concept, you can solve any problem on the exam within 1 minute.
Oh,
Context, the real question, and the options and their variances, their differences.
So
And
back to your alternatives analysis, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they can actually use that not just on the exam, but they can use it to solve any problem.
Yeah. So it's interesting when you said context, that made me think that one of the best ways that I've learned to do this is, first of all, whether it's context or whether it's, I think it's the same kind of thing. It's just understanding. If you cannot describe the problem in 1 or 2 sentences, you don't understand it. Context, issues surrounding, whatever it is, if you can't describe it in 1 or 2 sentences, you don't understand it. So that would be my first one for any budding project manager that's faced with a problem. Describe it, write it down on paper and see if that makes sense. And I think the other part was, another part that I like is there has to be some analysis. And this is probably some of the part that you were talking about in terms of alternatives, because there's not just the analysis of the problem, but in analyzing the solution is when you're looking at different alternatives to that solution. And here's a mistake that project managers often make, which they shouldn't. They try to solve it on their own. There is nothing better, in my experience, than, I think you used the example earlier, pulling someone into a boardroom, grabbing a pen, going to the whiteboard and sketching it out in terms of just analyzing what that problem is.
Yeah, and you want a varying range of experts in that room too.
Yes.
Because your engineer is going to bring that focus, your database analyst is going to bring that, your financial analyst is going to bring that. A chief executive doesn't have a chief finance information technology operations officer for nothing. They're doing the same thing with their problems. They're looking for the different facets of the opinions and perceptions so that they can put that together.
But let me add two more to what you had talked about. I like those three. That's very simple, the three that you gave. Let me add two more to this. And one would be, how about looking at the fact that there's some root causes? Because if I know the root cause, not only can I kind of hone in on that problem quicker, but I can also look to the fact that from that problem, I can look at having it not recur again.
Yes.
So that would be one, would be the root cause part of it. And then secondly would be to measure the results. We often forget this part. We go, we analyze the problem, we look at root causes perhaps, we do all of these things right, we implement it, and then we go on our way. How about we come back and look at it the next week, the week after that, for a few weeks and see what possibly could have resulted as a result of the decision we made. Was it a good result? Could we have made a different decision for a better result? But if we don't sort of analyze the results, we also don't know that the next time something like this occurs, that we would have a way of solving that problem because we haven't learned from the previous one.
Right. And observing the results gives you your continuous improvement as well.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. You've closed the loop on all of that. I like your root cause analysis too. There's, what is it, 19 different forms of analysis that are documented in the PMBOK. It's ridiculous. And the first 6 or 7 do include root cause analysis. It's fascinating, the thoroughness and as well the simplicity that 50 authors got together and said, this is just the way it is. And you don't really understand that until, once again, you spend time, you think it through, and you really play with knowledge. We don't have time like that as a project manager, but what we need to do is start considering building in that time, not just in solving problems, but also with our personal improvement.
Well, and I would also say that without a root cause analysis, we fall into that age-old tradition of fixing the symptoms. Mm-hmm. And if you only fix the symptoms, you have dealt with this problem at this time, but you haven't dealt with this same problem that comes up 3 months from now.
Right.
Or prevent it from coming up again because you haven't done the root cause analysis.
Exactly.
And just quickly, I had this was a 2-part question on my part, just very quickly in the couple of minutes that we have left. How would we teach this to new project managers, this problem solving technique or one that they develop for themselves that works for them? How would we teach them to use it to solve problems?
First of all, coaching and mentoring, giving them some background content that they can repeat and something they're comfortable with, but they're going to have to participate in developing it. Okay. And so they can take ownership. Without ownership, they're not going to adopt it. Second of all, giving them enough room and enough time to practice this as a habit until, they do this. And this is why I ask my students to go through 20 to 50 practice questions every day, because by the time on the exam, you don't want to be thinking in your head, context, real question, options, content. You don't want them to do that. You want it to be a natural thing. And that seems to take about, 5 to 8 weeks.
Well, I think with that last point you made there, where you let them have the chance to work it out on their own, let them also fail. Let them have the ability to fail with a net. Right. So it's not a disaster for the project, but how do we learn? I mean, I'm watching, my grandson now is 4 years old, but when he was probably 10 months old, he was trying to walk. Well, if I had been there every time he was about to fall to catch him, it would not have helped him. But because he fell, he got up, he fell, he got up, he eventually learned to walk. And that's the only way that we can come up with this ability to do that. So I think there's a way of helping them to work it out by themselves, to fail, and also to help them model it. So what do you think? Have we covered this topic fairly well?
Yes, and we've gotten a couple items that we can talk about in the future too. I am really happy about this conversation.
I agree. This was good. I think I'm going to go back and listen to this so that I don't forget what it takes to solve problems.
So where can we find you out on the worldwide internet?
Well, a couple places. One is obviously LinkedIn, Merv Jersak, or my company name, People First Project Management. And I've also got a website, peoplefirstprojectmanagement.com. So either place, I enjoy interaction with people, especially on topics like the one we just discussed.
Yes, and I as well can be found out on LinkedIn. I won't mention anything else right now, but in the months and weeks to come, we may have a lot more to talk about.
You bet. All right, until next week, Tim.
It's always a pleasure, Merv. And thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be talking to you soon.